Protactile Language Interpreting National Education Program presents Tactile Imagery. And now we have journeyed through the principles of protactile and arrived at the final principle, number 7, called tactile imagery, abbreviated as TI. To grammatically use tactile imagery, one must begin with using multiple locations on the receiver, perhaps the upper chest, along the H2 arm, and the thigh to move the story along. The movement and contact points used reenact the feeling of the point of the story so that the receiver can understand the same point being expressed. The story becomes real through the use of taps, glides, touches, and manipulation of the receiver's body, assembling the details into one cohesive utterance. With focused contact points, holding pressure on indexed locations, conveying movement, and using proprioceptive objects, whole ideas can be communicated. This is the intent of tactile imagery. All touch must occur in contact space, whether it's on the leg, arm, fingers, shoulders, or upper chest. The entire story must occur in contact space. What you can describe with tactile imagery is limitless. The point is how to convey a feeling. Tactile imagery is the use of grammatical features of PT to express ideas through taps, touch, and pressure. This is not simply drawing a two-dimensional object on the skin of the receiver. A flat image that mimics the outline of an object does not give the depth needed to create understanding. It cannot be felt. Some might try to describe an image by drawing an outline on the palm and painting it in by describing colors. This does not convey the same experience of the person receiving the description. When using tactile imagery, remember you're describing how something feels, not how it looks. For example, you can't feel color. However, it may be appropriate to say the color of an object to give the person an idea of it, but it does not enhance the idea of how something feels. Let's consider describing a flower. One might try to outline the petals of a typical flower on the thigh. This doesn't have the feel of a flower at all. Instead, a rich image is made when one calls for a proprioceptive object, asking the H2 hand to form a bud shape. Then you could demonstrate the bud opening and the petals reaching outward by peeling open the fingers. The open H2 hand then becomes a blossom with a circular center filled with the stamen and piston of a mature flower. Example 1. Tactile imagery, grooming a dog. Slow motion replay. I am a dog groomer, and one day there was a dog that I started to groom using brush clippers. Next, I used a scissor to cut around their face and ears. Once they were finished, I gave them an adoring look and gave them back to their owner. Right away, their owner gave the dog back to me. I was confused, and I said, "This isn't my dog, this is your dog." So I gave the dog back to the owner again. But again, instantly, they gave the dog back to me. And I said, no, 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 this is your dog. This is not my dog. You have to take this dog back. But the owner insisted and gave me the dog one more time. I gave it a cuddle, and I sighed, and I knew that this little one was going to be mine. Tactile Imagery explained. I first used the H2 arm and hand in the shape of a muzzle and ears to represent the dog. I then show picking up a brush and brushing out the dog's coat. Then I show the trimming of the fur by using a scissoring motion around its ears and muzzle. Then I show checking the coat and approving the grooming. Next, I use that same H2 arm and move it to the receiver's body, which indicates the owner. When I do that, the owner says they don't want the dog and they give it back to me, so that H2 arm moves to my body. And I say no, and we go back and forth like this until the owner decides that they do not want the dog, and I give in and decide to keep the dog, and so it's resting against my body. Example 2. Tactile imagery. Making salsa. Slow motion replay. I have the best salsa recipe. It's my favorite. It consists of only 3 ingredients. I start with a juicy, ripe tomato that's tender to the touch. I dice up that tomato, and the juices spill everywhere. I scoop up the diced tomatoes and lay them aside. Next, I grab an avocado. I remove the pit, and then take the avocado fruit and lay it next to the tomatoes. Finally, I grab an onion. I cut about a quarter of it off and dice it into tiny pieces, almost a mince. Once this is finished, I place them aside with the tomatoes and avocado. I then take all 3 ingredients and put them in a bowl together and mix them well. Finally, I grab a chip, I scoop some up, and enjoy the amazing salsa. It is mouth-watering. Absolutely my favorite. Tactile imagery explained. I begin my story by showing that I was eating something by using a tortilla chip to scoop it out of a bowl. The motion where I cup our hands together and shake them back and forth shows this is my favorite salsa. It's a salsa that I make with only 3 ingredients. The first ingredient I model is a soft, round object that when you press on it, bounces back slightly, showing that it's ripe. This represents a tomato. I then show how I dice it up and it releases juices. And then I explain that I take those diced tomatoes and I lay them aside. Another ingredient I talk about is an onion, which is shown with the H2 hand in the shape of a bulb. I then demonstrate peeling and chopping it. And I explain that I'm trying to get very tiny pieces. So I go from a big slice of onion to tiny diced, almost mince onions. And I place those aside. And a third ingredient that I talk about is an avocado. You can also change the orientation of your hands to be upright like this. I use the H2 and my H1 in a cupped twisting motion to show opening an avocado. An avocado has a large seed, so I use the H1 hand in a shovel-like way to show removing of the seed or the pit of the avocado. Then I scoop out the insides of the avocado using a hand shape that feels like a spoon while I create pressure on the inside of the H2 as the object I'm scooping from. Next in the process, we need a large bowl. The H2 becomes the bowl, while my H1 gathers the prepared ingredients from the index location on the thigh and combines them in the bowl. The mixing motion conveys a sense of ease. This is not a hard dish to make. I then show selecting the tortilla chip and dipping it in the salsa to enjoy. The squeezing motion I make on the receiver's shoulder indicates my enjoyment of the taste. It demonstrates that I really love this salsa and that it's my favorite. Example 3. Tactile imagery, a butterfly. Slow motion replay. A fuzzy little caterpillar with 2 antennae inched along and climbed up a tree. When it found the perfect branch, it made a cocoon. It then metamorphosed into a flitting, floating butterfly. Example 4. Tactile imagery, at the beach. Slow motion replay. We were strolling along on a hot, sunny day at the beach. Birds flapped by us in the sky, and one by one they landed and dug into the sand, each looking for a morsel. Finding what they wanted, they then flew away. We decided to investigate the abandoned hole and dug around a little more. We found the clamshell that had been washed up on the beach by the waves. The underside was smooth and empty. Flipping it over, we felt the tactile ridges that lined the shell. And tracing our fingers along the edges, we felt some places that were broken and others that were smooth. Noting that the birds had already devoured the insides. We put the empty shell back into its home, covered it up, and continued our walk by the crashing surf. Tactile imagery explained. That story is a good example of using tactile imagery in Protactile. First, I set my scene by using the forearm of the H2 to indicate a pathway. I used both the H1 and H3 along the H2 to show two people walking. Then I engaged the sensation of a strong sunbeam bearing down on the walkers by saying sun, then using my H1 and H3 to touch from the H4 shoulder across the upper chest with strong fingers, engaging the feeling of the sun pouring down. This is more effective than using airspace to indicate light or heat from above. Next, I describe birds flying past by flapping my fingers across the upper chest in a motion that mimics the wings of the bird. I then show the birds digging with their claws near the elbow of the H2. Zooming out, I show the two people walking along and then curiosity drawing them to the spot where the birds were scratching. When I sign find with my H1, my H3 does not lose contact with the location near the elbow at the site of the digging. This follows the principle of contact space. Throughout the whole story, we want to stay connected with the receiver and not at any time revert to using airspace to create our story. Tactile imagery relies on describing how something feels, not how it looks. This is how you draw your listener into the story. To describe what the found item is, I drag my H1 and H3 to the palm of H2, which shows I'm ready to describe the object just mentioned. As I do this, I continue to support the H2 hand with my H3 so the connection is never terminated. Turning the H2 palm down, I describe the feel of the item, not the appearance. I do this without fingerspelling an English word to name the object. Instead, the touch communicates what the object is. You can feel me describe the spines running rapidly down the cupped shape, which creates ridges and valleys in the scalloped edge. Then, the texture of the surface is described by randomly tapping my H1 fingers across the back of the H2. Lastly, I turn the H2 palm up in a cupped shape and touch it with the H1 in a hand shape that indicates a smooth, clean interior. This is the result after the birds snatched up their snack. You feel me staying in contact with the H2 by holding it with my H3 as the H1 and H4 sign that the birds have flown away after their score. I don't let go of the listener at any time. This is our discovery of the empty clamshell that the birds drew our attention to. I show the waves again washing over the spot that the clam was found by keeping contact between the H2 and H3, but using the H1 to sign waves across the spot near the bend of the elbow. Returning to the H2 as the object we are discussing, I manipulate the H2 into an upright cupped position and tap on it to say that, as in, that is what the birds were after. I then returned to a zoomed out description by using the H1 and H3 to walk along the H2 forearm and show the feeling of returning the shell to the spot and the two people walking away. To end the story, I again show the waves washing over the spot by using both my H1 and H3 to sign waves forcefully across the inner forearm of the H2, then draw my fingers down the forearm in a draining away motion as the sand recedes with the waves. This creates the emotion, or atmosphere of nostalgia, I intended with the story. The key to making this work with tactile imagery is to maintain constant contact with the receiver. The object of the story needs to be identified and emphasized, but the story is not limited to being expressed in one area. In this instance, the hand, for example. We must use all the appropriate contact space locations to create a fully immersive story. Disclaimer. This video was developed by Protactile Language Interpreting National Education Program, PLI, funded by a grant from the Rehabilitation Services Administration, RSA, grant number H160D21002. The contents of this artifact were developed under a grant from the Department of Education. However, these contents do not necessarily represent the policy of the Department of Education, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government.